Good afternoon. My name is Brian Hirsch. I run an accelerator program called AgileGov for people in government who are working to improve digital public services. We still have a lot to figure out about how government should work in the digital age, and people are innovating and uncovering better ways of delivering public services constantly. And I want to hear their stories and insights. I want to help successful approaches circulate faster to make it easier for all of us to build on what works and to spread our to spend our headaches on unsolved problems rather than reinventing wheels. And so in that spirit, I am really excited to bring on our guest today, Anthony Rogers, the Director of Technology Transformation for the state of Michigan, because he has some really great innovations that I got really excited about when I first heard about them, and I'm really excited for him to tell us about them today. And so here he is. Let's bring Anthony on. Anthony, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Brian. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for being here. So I'm going to do something I have not ever done on this live stream, which is bring on another screen to show some slides, because Anthony's process for running these technology solution assessments is really well documented, and I think that actually bringing some of his materials out in front of people will really make it concrete. So I'm going to turn on the screen share here. And Anthony, I wonder if you can just kick us off by telling us what the technology solution assessment is and why we need it.
So it really came out of our desire to de-risk our IT acquisitions. We know from a report called the Haze report from the Standish group that only 13% of large government IT projects are successful. And we basically, wanted to set about to change that. So part of it was really shifting from, we had an assessment model in place that was quite prescriptive, and it really was a very technological infrastructure focused assessment. We really wanted to shift that left and switch, from a sort of approval to advice, and make sure that we got out ahead of those acquisition decisions in time to actually influence them, rather than doing an after the fact assessment that really didn't matter.
Great. All right. So let's take a look at what that is. I was really struck when you shared the actual document with me by a couple of things right out of the gate in the purpose statement at the beginning of this document. So it says, the purpose is to ensure the quality of systems and applications. This is a multidisciplined technical review. What is a multidisciplined technical review?
So we've formed really what we call the architecture guidance team, and we really wanted to move away from viewing IT acquisitions through a purely technical lens. I think there's a tendency for sort of traditional enterprise architecture organizations to take a look at incoming technology from a purely technical lens, and we really wanted to view it through a number of other different lenses, things like user experience and a human-centered design, our procurement approach, the licensing terms, making sure that all these work in concert with IT strategy, and basically what forms good medicine for a government IT acquisition. So we went through, this is not a representative team, this is a kind of a skills matrix team. So we sort of went through an exercise where we figured out what were the core competencies that we needed to have in order to effectively do a holistic assessment of incoming IT. And we then filled that matrix with people who we knew from an assessment of their skills would actually not each individually wholly cater for each of at the domains, but as a total team, we would actually round out to make sure that in sum we had the capabilities that we needed.
Mm-hmm. I remember, when you were telling me about the assessment and referenced the Standish Haze report, and there's like shocking failure rates in government technology projects. One example that you shared with me was, one person who was a non-technical person had a project, that was described as mission critical, but in their original idea, didn't have the technical resources, the server, power, to treat it like a critical application. But then I think you've also had the experience that sometimes the problems aren't actually technical,
Right.
in the early stages of the RFP. Can you just talk a little bit about how this multidisciplined approach gets at that problem?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about a couple of things there. One is in the specific example that you gave, moving from a prescriptive approach to a descriptive approach, rather than having a set list of allowed things, and really looking at the behavior and the characteristics of the technology, allows us to, surface things where, the agency says this is a mission critical application. The technical architecture doesn't support that, right? It's on a single server in a single data center. And unless they're willing to make the investment to, multi-home it, or, regionally disperse it, the investment doesn't really match their view of how critical it is. And part of the assessment can actually point that out. Having the sort of the multidisciplined approach helps us apply some of the sort of user journey, human-centered design questions very early on in the process. And it helps the agency team that's doing the acquisition make sure that they know what they're actually acquiring. What is the problem they are trying to solve? What is the outcome they want? And then we can then work backwards from that outcome to actually test, at least conceptually test the proposed acquisition and make sure that it's going to deliver the capabilities and the outcome that they want. So it's not just about the technology. Can we support it? Will it work? Does it integrate with this, that, or the other? It's really shifting as far left as we possibly can, providing input, advice, and guidance into each phase of the acquisition process so that we end up with a solid solution that will deliver the expected outcome.
Great. Okay, so I want to jump ahead to another thing that jumped out at me in this introduction when it talks about the purpose of the TSA. So multidiscipline review, ensure that things can proceed to standards, and performance requirements within cost at an acceptable risk.
One of the key things about being a sort of EA or being an architecture guidance team is that we don't have any money, right? So we don't actually make that acquisition a decision, and we're not realizing the agency function and a mission outcome. We all know that there's no such thing as zero risk, right? And or if there is, it's extremely expensive. And agencies with their budgets, with their strategic goals, with their function and mission imperatives, have to make trade-offs between cost, desired functionality, expected outcome. And our job is to point out the risks. We offer architectural guidance and advice, not architectural decision making. And we make sure that every agency that goes into an IT acquisition is at least aware of the risks, what the implications are, the speed bumps that they might encounter later. And we don't tell them to eliminate the risk, we prepare them for it. And we say, understand that if you take this direction, you are going to have this problem in 2, 3, 5 years time. Don't necessarily run away from it, but at least build it in to the total cost of ownership, build it into your refresh plan, build it into your budget request so that you can deal with the risk when it actually happens. And ultimately, the acceptance of that risk is an agency decision.
Yeah, I love this frame. So you're asking everyone to come and get checked through your process, but then you're not telling them what they can and can't do. Right. You're just telling them what your assessment of their risk is. Exactly. And then ultimately it's their decision about whether they want to assume that risk or not. Yeah. So great. Okay, so then next, go on to after the purpose, you've got this instruction statement, and you say everyone needs to complete the TSA PreCheck Excellent little bit of marketing there. So everyone needs to complete the TSA PreCheck. And then depending on the PreCheck, which I was amazed at how easy the PreCheck is, you may or may not have to proceed with a technology solution assessment, right?
Yeah.
So do you mind if I just show people my sort of paraphrase of what those questions were? I just thought,
Absolutely.
You put good thought work into these PreCheck questions, and love the way you're triaging here. So the basic questions you're asking people are: do you store critical government information? Is your application public? Are there 1,500 or more staff, contractors, or vendors, government people, who are users of this application? Is it going to cost $10 million or more? And is this project going to run 3 years or more? And if they say no to all of those things, they don't need to do a check. Is that a good summary of the check process?
That is pretty much it. And the PreCheck actually performs two functions for us. One is making sure that those small, low impact, if somebody's buying, 50 mice, it is technically an IT acquisition, and we certainly want to know about it. But it certainly doesn't rise to the level of, warranting a full technology assessment. We want people who are doing small things or doing the right things to be sped on their way. But the other important thing that it does for us is, we're a team of finite resources. We can do X number of assessments in a given year. And we want to focus those assessments on the acquisitions that truly need it. And what we know from sort of empirical research in the sort of government IT acquisition space is we know that certain things make solutions important enough to be assessed. And if they contain, information that needs to be protected, if they're public facing, et cetera, and we know that if all the answers to all of these questions are no, it really probably isn't something that is either accessible, it's pure infrastructure or something like that, or it's something that is of low enough impact that it really doing a full assessment isn't going to actually yield any value.
Got it. Great. So before I go further down the rabbit hole into your process, I know we've got some questions coming in. So why don't we take a couple questions here. And I wonder if we can bring some questions up on the screen. Question 1, is it possible for agencies to bypass this assessment and still procure things? Or is your procurement process pretty airtight and people can't get around it?
That's a really good question. And from it, I can tell that person is probably working in government themselves. So, yes, I mean, in theory, on paper, we have a couple of things, working in our favor. And for a start, this sort of solution assessment process is enshrined in our policy. So it says that, every IT acquisition needs an assessment. Historically, that's meant that, even the smallest things, they all have to go through the whole thing. And what we've done with things like the PreCheck is we've been able to sort of have a speedy exit ramp for those smaller projects. But certainly in theory, yes. The other thing we have working in our favor is we have a procurement office and we have an attorney general's office who are very much up to speed and very supportive of our de-risking approach. So they are working hard with us to make sure that the overall acquisition procurement process incorporates this assessment model at each of the key phases along the way. So we're still putting that into practical effect, but we've had a lot of support from our procurement area, from our project management office, from the AG, and from our financial services people, because they get to tidy up the mess, right, when things go wrong. So they're invested in the success of this program in the same way we are. So we're very fortunate that way. Of course, things bypass, things always do. And it's not completely foolproof, but what I think we are able to do is focus our efforts on those highest risk acquisitions and make sure they get our love, and not worry so much about at the lower risk things. We're not looking to capture absolutely every single thing. As long as we're capturing those things that the pre-check indicates need an assessment, that's probably good enough.
Great. I'm going to take one more question now, and we'll do a few more rounds of questions. So please keep the questions coming, folks, even if we don't get to yours, right this second. Can we pull one more up on the screen? I know there are more questions.
I think we have the same one a couple of times. I think that was it.
Once Michigan has defined and approved a technology solution design, does this become a standard architecture or solution pattern that other departments or projects can review for adoption?
So to answer that, I think, there's a couple of things kind of going on here. First of all, my division is actually split into two teams. One team, the one that does this particular process that we're looking at now, is firmly pre-acquisition. So we're really looking at, characteristic behavior. We're not really looking at a deployment architecture or an infrastructural architecture. That's more of a pre-implementation phase. That's, once we've decided what we're going to either build or buy, how do we insert that into our various different hosting in environments in a way that is efficient, supportable, secure, and cost effective. And that's where the other half of my division comes in, and they are the sort of implementation designers. So it's the implementation designers that come up with those sort of solution patterns, the actual implementation designs that are repeatable, they are modular. But there's a couple of kind of nuances that I want to kind of touch on. One is the word approval. We don't approve anything. And we provide advice and guidance, and that's following Martin Fowler's advice process. And I'm sure we can provide a link to that post when this event gets published. So we don't really approve anything anymore, and that's one of the things that we specifically wanted to get away from. And then the other thing, I think people who work in government probably understand this more than most, is we're not a Walmart or a Walgreens or a McDonald's. We don't do the same thing 5,000 times in various different locations. So standardization is a bit of a kind of a pipe dream. We do 5,000 things in each individual agency. We have thousands and thousands of lines of a business, and standardization over standardization is a little bit of a trap. It's really hard to come up with a standard enterprise architecture that meets the needs of state police and ecologists in a DNR and benefits claims in health and human services. We can provide overall, guidance around, concepts, approach, but it's hard to have at the sort of technology infrastructure level, it's hard to have a one size fits all.
So Anthony, first I want to give you kudos for being the first person on my show to ever cite Martin Fowler. That's awesome. And, there's something that this question makes me think of that I wasn't going to bring into the conversation because it's pretty geeky, but now I'm going to go there. And that is architecture design records. I love that your TSA process drives toward the creation of an architecture design record. And I can't help wondering, this person obviously was asking about approvals, but I think what they're getting at is, can I, as someone who has a new procurement, look at other procurements or other patterns and follow the pattern somehow? Mm-hmm. And so I can't help wondering, I know you and your team in the future can look at the past architecture design record from some application that's being updated or changed. I wonder if I am someone at an agency working on a brand new procurement, and in the same way I could go look at other RFPs to see how have people put them together, can I look at architecture design records to see what kinds of solutions might I model my solution after?
One of our fundamental team sort of norms is a default to open. So we work in the open. There are no secrets. One of the advantages of having a sort of an assessment that focuses on behavior and the characteristics over technological specifics is that there's no secrets contained in the assessment itself. And that allows us to publish it, widely internally. And that was one of the fundamental principles that we adopted. So every artifact that we generate as people go through our process is available to everybody else. Once things like, RFC evaluations and everything else that have to be behind closed doors are actually done, and we can then actually publish things. But the ADR is a big deal for us, and actually our focus has shifted as we've developed this process and the associated product away from making sure everybody has a completed assessment to using the assessment as a way to arrive at a well-written, acceptable ADR. And what we're finding is that, again, our procurement people and even the CTO are starting to embrace the concept of an architectural decision record more and more and more. The key is getting quality quality ADRs. And so we use some of the sort of human-centered design questions from the US Digital Service Playbook to help people flesh out things like the context and a problem statement section of the ADR. Rather than just providing with a kind of a blinky cursor problem, we actually guide them through what a good one looks like, what questions does it actually answer. And I think the final point really around this whole model is that we want to make sure that our model is accurate for our organization. So one of the things that we do is when we publish all this information, we also do assessments, 2, 3, 5 years later to see, were we right? We predicted in this risk model that this project would be challenged, and were we right? Using these measures, let's discover how often we are right. And if we're wrong, obviously we have to change the model, because what we said would be risky in our organization is not. And if we're right all the time, we kind of get to say, ha, we told you so. But, that's not the real goal here. But, it's to provide, here is generally, empirically over time in our organization, the pattern, the approach, the design that is routinely successful. And then we can start, actually encouraging people more in that direction.
Yeah, so awesome that you have those documents, the ADRs, so valuable. I'm going to bring us back to the slides. There's so much more I want to get through. You mentioned US Digital Service, and I think that's the next place I want to go. So this on the screen is a screenshot of the State of Michigan's Technology Solution Assessment document. It is a spreadsheet, or it's a workbook with many spreadsheets in it. And so you can't actually see the whole thing. What you can see is the intro and then the tabs at the bottom. And so you can see there are so many tabs, I actually had to take 2 screenshots. And so, the little caret that pans across the tabs shows you the rest of the tabs in the second row. And so I was so surprised and excited when I saw this, the Digital Services Playbook track for assessments. In contrast to, you can see that the previous tab says traditional assessment track. So when Anthony and I were first talking about this, he said, I took interest in this TSA that he was telling me about, and he said, we follow the Digital Services Playbook, which I thought was wonderful. But I'm sort of nodding and thinking yeah. Like we're all following the Digital Services Playbook if we're in the digital service space. Everyone, many of us have read it, and Massachusetts Digital Service, where I was for the chief digital officer for a time. We read it, we practiced the plays, but the way I was thinking about it, so this is the website for people who haven't seen it. There's a website that has the Digital Service Playbook, and you scroll down and it's got these 13 plays. And if you click those numbers at the top right, there's jump links and these checklists that tell you about the plays. You obviously can't check these boxes. It's a website. It's just sort of like visualizing a checkbox. So I know that what I did, and I maybe I'm stupid, but I can't be the only one who's made this silly mistake. I can't check the boxes. I've never actually made a checklist from these checkboxes. I just read it and thought, do I do these things? Like, let's incorporate it into our organization's practice at Mass Digital. So then I saw what Anthony has done, which is so much simpler and so much better. They literally copy and paste the checkboxes from the Digital Services Playbook into this TSA document. So if I click the Digital Services Playbook track, the plays, all of them, are appearing here in the spreadsheet. And this is part of the assessment. So I just wanted to dig into this a little bit more and talk through. We obviously can't talk through all the plays, but there's so many good ones. There's so much here that is different, I think, from the way so many government organizations do an assessment. Could we zoom in on this first one I've circled here? So one of the plays is test prototypes of solutions with real people in the field if possible. Can you tell us what that looks like, and what kind of a circumstance would get a good assessment for something like that?
So the way that we work with this playbook track is that there is an initial assessment, and it's basically kind of what their plan is. They're planning to do all these things, and then we actually come back at various different stages during their actual project execution to see how they are doing. So the initial assessment is more expressing an intent to do these things, but really we actually do it in a sort of in-person session, and we actually ask them, we actually push them a little bit and say, are you really doing these things? But one of the things that we want to sort of talk about is one of the things that's hard for governments to do because of things like a contract language and risk and everything else, is implementing a piece of technology from a vendor in our environment where it's actually touching our stuff without having a contract in place. So this can be a tough play to execute. But one of the biggest sources of risk, and what's in that sort of 87% of IT projects that are either failed or challenged, is where we have not tried before we buy. So what we tend to do is we see fancy demos from our vendors and everything looks wonderful, oh, this is going to solve all our problems. So we buy it, we commit to it, and then we bring it into the organization, and oh, guess what? It doesn't work because of our firewalls, or it doesn't work because of our security posture on our servers, or because we're not deployed in this CSP or whatever. And of course now we're on the hook for it. So now what do? We have to stir things around and try and actually make it work. So what we've established, we have a line item in our sort of a small line item within our budget called technology trials. And what that does is it allows my team to actually buy and implement and actually operate for up to a year a new product. And they're usually pretty small, and it's generally within the CTO area. But what we're trying to do is lead by example and set the idea that it is possible to onboard these products and do a trial for real. In the sort of chief technology officer area, most of the solutions that we acquire are heavily integrated into things like Active Directory, into our various systems of record. We only know if they work if we can actually connect them to everything and make sure that they actually work. So we have this kind of technology trial program that allows at least us to do this, and we're hoping that the idea sort of spreads through the organization so that we can actually try before we buy.
Mm-hmm. So if someone's listening to this from the state of Michigan and they're thinking, try before we buy, that sounds awesome. Is your vision that person, emails you tomorrow and says, hey, Anthony, I'd like to get in line for try before I buy. Can I use your funds to try this thing? Or is your idea that they create their own fund in their organization that does something similar?
Yeah. I think, the way the government funding works is, generally each agency is actually separately funded. So, while we wouldn't want to, put people off, we generally focus the CTO funds on things that are either, of interest from a kind of a CTO operations point of view, or are sort of enterprise-wide. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we're trying out a URL shortener. So a lot of people ask us, can we get a URL shortener? And all the ones we used to use are either dangerous or they've been shut down. But we'd really love one. So we're actually running one. And what happens at the end of the year is, if we haven't found a service owner, and we haven't found a, a permanent funding for it, and we're a primarily rate recovery organization, so we have to find people who are actually willing to pay for it, it gets shut down. So if something halfway through the year is looking like it's going to be a huge success, we have to spend the remainder of that year finding a home, finding someone who's going to take over the care and feeding, finding someone who's actually going to fund it and actually establish it as an enterprise service. Otherwise, unfortunately, it's behind the woodshed time.
Yeah. Are there, I can imagine it being more complex if you're not in the office of the CTO getting buy-in for this, because obviously people don't want someone to put something critical in this try before you buy, experimental space.
Yeah.
If someone wants to do this, do you have guidance that is as easy to understand as the TSA PreCheck that you could say, like, here, these are our rules for a CTO's office. Here's how you do it at HHS. Or is that something to be worked out?
I think it's probably something to be worked out, but I think there's a couple of things that we have learned. You have to be absolute on the 1 year lifespan. So we only execute contracts for a year, and it has to go away. If it's not properly established with the proper governance and actual contract and negotiations and a bid and everything else, it really, you do have to commit to the concept of a trial. We're trialing this out. And before we actually commit to anything beyond a year, we're going to go through the proper RFPs, and we're actually going to do a proper acquisition for it. And because what happens, of course, is if you don't have that hard stop date, what is a trial becomes, fully operational, but it's still a trial. So it never gets, the full attention that it should get. So to me, that is the fundamental, the biggest thing to do is make sure that it is limited to a year, and you're really hard about that. I mean, we keep telling people, midnight on this date, if there's not an owner, it is going to die, because I don't want my team, left holding the bag, running this thing for, in perpetuity. And I think the other thing is to be very risk aware. I think you have to understand, what it is that you're actually doing. But if you do it, diligently and well, it is very feasible.
Great. All right. There's so much more I want to pull up. I also know there are more questions coming in. Why don't we take another question or two, and then we'll look at the next one. Can you share details about how an agency experiences the TSA PreCheck? Do they submit a request in the web portal? Do they schedule a meeting with you? Do they get a written response from your team?
It's actually all of the above, except for the web portal piece. So we're a little embarrassed. This was a sort of MVP. And before we invested in any sort of, product development, programming and everything else to actually create an actual proper web portal, we wanted to get the model right, and we wanted to get people to understand it and get comfortable using it. The previous sort of old version of it, was also an Excel workbook. So it provided a little bit of continuity with the old process. So yeah, we would love to get to an actual web portal application that we can actually have, proper data, because obviously an Excel workbook is not the best way to, particularly an Excel workbook that's, formatted like a paper form is not a great way to get data out. But we have the AGT, we have open office hours, where people can come and just ask us, general questions. How do you get started? What should I put on, this line? But we also have a regularly scheduled consultation sessions with the architecture guidance team. So we've actually helped people through, particularly their first one. We've kind of walked them through the process in a facilitated workshop. And then the AGT itself actually meets every week to do its formal review of each of the assessments and ADRs.
Great. All right, I'm going to pull up another question. You talked about your team starting up a new service and then looking for a permanent home for it if it's successful. Was that part of your original purpose, or did the practice develop over time?
No, this is brand new. This is brand new for like FY24. So it's become very obvious to me, as we sort of have developed this kind of de-risking approach. Try before you buy is one of the biggest risk factors. If you don't know it's going to work, if the confidence level that it is going to actually work for real is low, and it usually is unless you can actually try it. The only measure of success is a working code in a sort of application environment, and if you haven't actually got it working, there's a high probability, or certainly there's a relatively high risk that it may not work, and you certainly don't know the answer. And committing government funds when you don't know if it's going to work or not is not a good idea. So I kind of badgered my boss to provide a small amount of sort of equity funding from from his sort of office budget to spin up this kind of technology trial space so that we could actually do that. I mean, we were looking at some solutions ourselves internally within our own CTO organization that could potentially answer some hard questions for us, particularly as we move to the cloud and need to get our arms around things like asset inventory, identity and access management in the cloud. There's some really cool tools out there, but to make sure they work, they've got to connect to our actual AD. They've got to connect to our actual cloud tenants, and we've got to see the value coming back. A slick demo, great, but is it actually going to provide value in our environment with our data connected to our systems? And the only way to do that is to try it. Otherwise, you're just guessing.
Yeah. Sounds like there's a lot to learn once we get through a few of these cycles.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be really fascinating to know, the success rate on projects that started with prototypes. Have you seen any RFPs follow early prototyping work? I know you're only just barely past halfway into this first cycle.
Yeah, we really haven't. And I think what we would expect is that the RFP would be post technology trial, not necessarily have the technology trial as part of it. So I think what it would form part of the market research phase of going out to actually RFP, because there are things you learn as you do a technology trial that are not necessarily technology related. Of course, you want to find out, does the thing technologically work? If I hit the start button, will it actually spin up and deliver value? But by prototyping it with its eventual users, so saying, hey, we're actually trying this particular product out, and here's how it works. Is this something close to what you want? Mm-hmm. You then start learning about what are the true kind of user needs. What are the. It allows your users, particularly as you do at the user research and the user journey work, to really get their hands on something tangible that they can then critique. Trying to create kind of user experience requirements in a vacuum is very, very hard. If you can put something up in front of them and say, how do they interact with it? Do they like it? What do they like? What don't they like? That's a very tangible user research that you can then carry forward into your RFP, because you now know what your users want or don't want.
Yeah, so this is not, I made some assumptions that I think were not correct. So this is not just try it before you buy it. If you want to, test something out for a quarter and then go forth and issue your RFP, go for it. The expectation is that people use it for a year, they iterate a couple times, they get user feedback a few times, and all of that is informing, some bigger or later RFP.
Yeah.
Wow, great. So awesome. Okay, let's go back to this document and see what we've got up next here. So another play from the digital services playbook is ship a functioning minimum viable product, MVP, that solves a core user need as soon as possible, no longer than 3 months from the beginning of a project, using a beta or test period if needed. Mm-hmm. Tell us about this one.
So that's right out of the digital service playbook. One of the de-risking approaches from the H&F de-risking guide is to actually break your sort of monolithic acquisition up into sort of modular components that you can implement you know, sort of as sort of individual, feature releases. But the overall principle here is that the more often you release code to your users, and the more often, the sooner they get their hands on it, the better earlier feedback you get about whether or not you're heading in at the right direction. So, one of the biggest risk factors in that, in that 87% that I keep talking about is the size of the project. And we use, spend and a duration as sort of, proxies for size. If you spend, like $100 million with a vendor expecting delivery of the complete solution in a year or 2 years' time, and when it arrives, it's wrong, then you've got 2 years worth of expenditure to fix. If you deliver your first MVP within 3 months and the users hate it, you've only spent 3 months, and there's a lot less to fix. A pivot is a lot less expensive. You've sort of reduced your spent cost fallacy surface area to a much smaller amount. But so it's a combination of, early discovery of either success or failure. And it's about delivering business value early. Businesses who are spending money on information technology projects don't like to wait for years for it to actually come to them. They want to start stuff now. So there's the whole kind of, a roller skate first, then a skateboard, then a bicycle, then a go-kart, and then a car. They can start rolling down the road with your first iteration. Okay, they might get wet, there's nowhere to put their golf clubs or whatever, but the prioritization of your backlog has rolling down the road as your first thing, and you deliver that soon, so that they immediately start having that kind of a business value. So that's one aspect. There's the breaking up of large government IT contracts into smaller pieces, and there's the ability to quickly pivot if things aren't going well.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, I'd love to get into some, real like end user stories, and I think this one, I think you got some good ones on this. So there's another play that I love that says a product owner has been identified, and I think that through the pandemic, you really saw the huge impact that this can have, right, with the cars application.
Yeah, cars was less pandemic driven than just really sort of operational need driven. So cars is our Secretary of State online application for, all things vehicle, driver license, RVs and boating. And what's a really compelling story about it is every state has their sort of DMV horror show. It's become a trope, right? The huge queues and everything else. And I think, to an extent, we suffered from it, as much as anybody. Where product ownership comes in, strong product ownership comes in, is driving the technology to meet a business need. So really, I hesitate to put words in her mouth, but, our Secretary of State and her sort of operations was focused not so much on, let's be cool and go online, but focused on real world agency function and mission needs, like the cost of staffing branch offices, the number of, of abandoned visits, and the customer experience of, lining up around at the block, the delays, the fact that we had to start, sending our reminders out earlier and earlier and earlier to help people make, get their appointments. So for them, it was an operational need based on the staffing of the actual physical in-branch offices and of the call centers that really drove the technology. So that product ownership manifests itself in ensuring that the business outcomes are embedded in the technology project. So with a purely technological lens, you would tend to sort of, being online is cool, right? I mean, everybody wants it. We know our constituency, wants to interact with us more online. but having that fundamental operational business driver behind that, it wasn't just about being cool to be online and let's count how many online users we get. It was more about what is the operational impact on our branch offices, having to staff them, having to manage the volume, having to deal with each individual customer, in person in at the branch office. And I can tell you from my experience now in my local Secretary of State offices, they're deserted half the time. Now, I'm sure you can find examples in larger towns where they're still pretty busy, but if you go in there and really look at what people are doing, they're doing things that you can't do online. Taking a road test, taking an online test, dealing with complex transactions around vehicles or 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 a licensing. But when you renew your tags and your driver's license here in the state now, it's 3 or 4 clicks and you're done. And they come in the mail like a week later. I mean, it's revolutionized that whole process.
Am I remembering right that you told me there used to be lines out the door, and now it's like they're empty because so many of the services have moved online?
Yeah, I mean, and that's been my sort of personal experience. I mean, I remember, having to wait in line for 2 hours outside, like one of our offices. And now, I mean, a couple of times I've had to specifically go to an office for a couple of things, and I mean, they've been pretty much deserted.
Yeah. And we're asking about the role of talking about. Sorry, I think we got a bad connection for a second.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about end-to-end service delivery, and not just the online experience.
Right,
Obviously,
exactly.
Government is in the service delivery business, not in the software delivery business. And so, I wonder if you can just talk a little bit more about the relationship between the product owner, whose job is to get those transactions online, collaborating with the people who are watching.
Right.
Wait times or any kind of business metrics. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the digital service plays is to address the entire experience from start to finish. And then when you look into that and look at some of the questions, it's about how is this technology solution positioned within the overall framework. So it's important to have a strong product owner from a technology perspective for a given product like cars. But it's very important to have that kind of very strong link with the business owner, of which the technological deployment is only a part of the story. So it really sets, going back to what we were saying, it really sets the role of the technology in the wider context of actually operating the agency function and a mission.
Yeah. So it doesn't work if you have the product owner managing the website in a silo over here, and then
correct.
The
completely
business operations
isolated from the business operations. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great. Okay, why don't we bring a couple more questions up here before I go on to the next part of the spreadsheet. How are you staffing this? Where do all these different perspectives come from?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So we're pretty, in terms of direct staffing, we're a pretty small team. But what we do is, again, we have a couple of these sort of long-running structural things that actually work in our favor if we position ourselves to actually take advantage of them. A long time ago, one of my sort of predecessors built into the job descriptions of our senior solution architects across the agencies a contribution to the sort of EA architectural practice. So you'll notice in the position description of our sort of senior architect is, a kind of a 10 or 15% of their job is actually participating in the EA sort of architectural practice. So that's been in there for quite a long time. Nobody actually cashed those chips until I came along and we said, okay, we're going to actually have, share that 10 or 15% with us. So that architecture guidance team is actually made up of people from across the organization. It's not just EA in their, in their little tower, but we have people from, from the group that supports the agencies. We have people from our infrastructure side of the house. We have people from our data management side of the house. And then we have some of the softer skills, things like license management, a procurement expert, a human-centered design expert, and people from various different levels in the sort of infrastructure stack that understand application, they understand middleware, they understand, network storage, all those different elements that we have to actually put together. So in a way, we're kind of borrowing people, but we're kind of borrowing them with a good intent, with the backup of, hey, it says in your PD that you're supposed to do this. So, and we selected them not only just for their, competence and capability, but for their fit in terms of understanding the direction that we wanted to go in. So we're a very closely gelled team with a very common sort of sense of what it is that we're trying to actually get done here.
You rattled off so many departments and great skills that you can draw from. Am I remembering correctly that there's also another called the Office of Continuous Improvement? Am I imagining that?
Yeah, that's where the human-centered design practice actually sits. So we have an Office of continuous improvement, and part of their practice, they do a lot of things like lean, process improvements, and that kind of thing in a more traditional sort of Six Sigma type of approach. But there's a burgeoning human-centered design practice within there, and we've established a very good working relationship with them. They're delighted that we're asking all those hard, human-centered design, user experience questions early in the process. And often, there will be a sort of a co-referral type of thing where, they'll hear about something and they say, you really should go through the TSA process. And we'll hear about something and say, you really should go and do a workshop with the HCD people. So there's a lot of synergy and kind of sort of cross-pollination going on there. But we have the manager of the HCD practice actually as a member of the architecture guidance team. And he asks all sorts of difficult questions, which honestly, the human-centered design questions that we ask, if you don't know the answer, you're not ready to buy or build anything.
I'm so sorry. I think that I had another connection issue for a second there. So does the Office of Continuous Improvement have user experience researchers in-house who can do usability research, or are they contracting out for that?
No, we have some good advice in terms of establishing the practice, from outside. But we have a team of people. In fact, I'm actually using them, wearing a slightly different hat. That's not really part of this conversation, but I'm actually engaged with that team to do some pretty significant user research around one of the other initiatives that I'm actually working on right now. So yeah, they're doing it in-house. We have that capability.
What an incredible resource. That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if there's another question. How do you decide who does traditional assessment track versus digital services playbook track?
Well, I promise I'm not prompting anybody to ask these questions, but I was going to cover this point anyway, because I knew it would come up. So we tend to point people at the digital service track if they're doing a sort of a truly agile in-house build. And when I say in-house build, I don't necessarily mean that the actual work resources have to come from within the state of Michigan. It's about addressing the model where we're the product owners, we own the code, we own the quality, we own the testing, we own the acceptance, and all we're going outside for is the labor to actually write the code. And so that's that kind of product ownership question. But if you're executing a lot of the plays in the digital service playbook, and if you're doing that sort of agile kind of, in-house kind of, modular development, following the kind of de-risking approach, you're a good candidate for the digital service track. What we do is we say, if you believe you're going in that direction, give the digital service track a try. It's constructed in a way where certain questions are actually mandatory for you to say yes to, and others are kind of optional. And there's a kind of a minimum score. unless you're doing at least this much of the digital service playbook, you're not really doing a digital service track. Please go and complete the traditional track instead. But we also provide guidance to people to kind of shortcut that. We say if you're deploying in a very traditional way, on premise, it's a bit of a monolith, it's a custom COTS, or it's one of the more kind of a legacy, acquisition approaches. We say, you know what, just go straight to the traditional track, because you're going to be told to go there anyway, and to save yourself the time.
Mm-hmm. Do you have people come to you and say, we want to be modern and agile, and we want to have a stellar 21st century digital experience with the new thing we want to buy, but they really have no existing capability or maturity in that area? I assume you don't have someone dive headfirst into all 13 plays all at once.
No.
How do you help someone down the road if they're just starting? They're like, we want to do all these things. Where do you suggest they start, or how do you figure out where they should start?
I think that's part of our digital service playbook track. We haven't required everybody to answer yes to every single question or do every single thing. What we've done is we've identified within each play critical things that you need to do if you want to follow that kind of methodological approach to delivering IT, or delivering software. And it's not a progression. The plays are really not a progression. My advice is to organizations is figure out which of the plays are achievable and necessary for you to be successful. Deploying on a modern stack may or may not be necessary. Defaulting to open may or may not be necessary, and is actually quite challenging for state government. So maybe think about making those optional. But there are going to be critical things, particularly higher up in the user experience space, the human-centered design space, the product ownership space, and the contract structure space, that are really essential if you want to go down that path. You will not be successful without them.
Great. Okay, I'm so tempted to ask a few more follow-ups, but we should let people who've been chatting have the final questions here. Let's see if we can get to one or two more before we're out of time. This is a really different way of working. How do you get someone to make their first prototype or MVP?
That's a really good question. I think part of it is adopting that purely agile model, and really doing agile, not just putting agile at the top of your forms and then saying, yay, we're doing agile. But it's about setting your user and your sort of business owners' expectations that is how you're going to deliver, and then doing it. Don't be afraid. Fail fast, iterate and recover. And it's about setting. It's a little bit about becoming sort of comfortable with discomfort, and also accepting of not outright failure, but things that the users don't quite like as much as you expected. I mean, in a kind of a traditional approach, that's disaster, right? If the users didn't like the color you picked or whatever, it's like, oh my God, like did you not ask them hard enough, But it's about, oh well, we didn't know that, so let's fix it next time. And it's okay. It's okay not to be perfect. And I think that's honestly the first step, is be okay with not being perfect.
Be okay with not being perfect. It's an important one. Let's see if we can fit. That's it. If for time. Okay. So I think we're gonna have to wrap up there. Anthony, I just want to say before we drop off here, what an incredible gift to the other departments in the state of Michigan, that you're working so hard on this,
Mm-hmm.
and making these kinds of innovations possible and within reach for so many people. I bet there are a lot of people who have no idea how incredible that is. But I certainly see it, and I think a lot of people watching see it.
Well, thank you.
Way to go. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today. It's been really a pleasure to talk to you.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Brian.
All right. Thanks, Anthony. Folks who are still here, actually, I'm going to go back to this screen where you can see the bit.ly link. Great. Please take a moment to go to this URL, give us feedback, let us know how to keep making these live streams better and making this the best possible use of your time. And thanks for tuning in.